Okay, well, we are going to kick off our next session, another interesting panel session for you. And our moderator for this session is Alexandra Bourne. Alexandra is a senior policy advisor at the Climate and Green Plan Implementation Office of Manitoba Environment and Climate, and she provides support for our Government of Manitoba board member. And we're really happy to have Alex here to moderate our session. Come on up, Alex.
Well, thank you, Kara, for the opportunity to moderate the session. I'm very excited about this because my background is in wetland biology, so I have a particular interest in this area. So I guess I'd like to call up the speakers to come sit at the front. And while they're coming up to sit, I'll just give a bit of background on this session. This session, we will be hearing about how we can make the case for nature-based solutions as a cost-effective adaptation measure. We all know that nature-based solutions can bridge Canada's growing infrastructure gap and strengthen regional resilience to climate change. There is growing evidence of the economic value of investing in natural infrastructure, which typically brings greater co-benefits compared with gray infrastructure solutions. This session will discuss how natural infrastructure is increasingly being considered as infrastructure in Canada, and the role it can play in meeting our service needs in a changing climate. So our first presentation that we're going to hear from today is Joanna Eyquem. Joanna is the Managing Director of Climate Resilient and Infrastructure at the Intact Center for Climate Adaptation at the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo. Her focus area at the Intact Center are the role and value of natural and nature-based solutions in managing natural hazards, flood and erosion resilience from the home to watershed scale, measures to reduce risks from extreme heat, and addressing physical climate risk and natural capital in the finance sector. Joanna sits on over 20 advisory committees, including Canada's National Adaptation Strategy Advisory Table on Resilient Natural and Built Infrastructure, and is a board member of the Municipal Natural Assets Initiatives. Joanna's presentation today is entitled The Role and Value of Natural Infrastructure in Canada. So please welcome Joanna.
Thank you so much, Alex. So it's great to see you here in Winnipeg again on a great sunny day. This is the, sorry, just sort out my technology here. So yeah, making the case for nature-based solutions. I think we're hearing an increasing amount about nature-based solutions in Canada and internationally. And, you know, Canada is not alone in looking at nature-based solutions, and actually, you know, it's already been investigated and used elsewhere. So there's lots of opportunities to learn lessons and really kind of speed up the way that we integrate nature-based solutions. And I want today to really look at the kind of the business case as well, and why this is part of our economy and an important kind of financial consideration as well. So to start at the beginning, you know, often we have some issues with nomenclature and nature-based solutions as a kind of relatively new term. I feel I've been working on this for over 20 years, but it's only come into our kind of lexicon fairly recently. So in terms of a standardized way of thinking about it, I've gone to the IUCN Global Nature-Based Solutions definition, which is actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So it's not just tree planting. Which often is compounded by people say, oh, I don't really agree with nature-based solutions. It's like, well, I'm not sure where you're coming from, because this is the definition. In terms of the difference between green and natural infrastructure, you know, there's this kind of continuum that we think about, and this image is from the city of Calgary. I quite like this image because it kind of shows that there's a kind of a blurred boundary between what we think of natural assets, so, you know, forests, wetlands, natural ecosystems, things that we maybe have modified and then enhanced, like constructed wetlands, you know, green space in our urban centers are not natural, but do provide services to us that nature provides. And then more engineered systems like that mimic natural systems of infiltration, like green roofs. So this is kind of continuum of different things. And the CCM has a great definition of natural infrastructure, which is kind of nature-based solutions that deliver infrastructure services to us. So this follows on from Chris's presentation a little bit. So this is a look at the catastrophic insurable losses and the increase that we're seeing. And this, we're looking at climate change, but underlying this curve is also continued degradation of our natural ecosystems and our kind of natural resilience to things like flooding and erosion. Most of the losses are not insured. I think Chris already underlined that, but also not all of the impacts are financial. So this doesn't include all the kind of health impacts, the mental health, the physical and mental impacts that we're also feeling, the stress. So it's very much nature-based solutions are not just to tackle an environmental issue. And I think so these are a couple of diagrams from the Desk Up to Review, which many of you have probably read. And it really kind of challenges what we think of as the economy. So often what we think of as the economy is kind of material goods, produced goods, what's here is termed produced capital. But there's a whole kind of range of things that the economy depends on, like human capital and natural capital, that are not factored into our normal discourse about the economy. We somehow have social, environmental, and then economy is somehow separate. And this is really being challenged now, because what we think of as economy really englobes the three capitals. And so that's kind of a basis for this discussion that we're also going to have on nature-based solutions is, they are all part of our economy as well. This is work from the World Economic Forum. We probably had this quoted at you ad infinitum since COP15, that $44 trillion of over half world's GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature. So not only are nature-based solutions important for reducing risks to climate, they're also important to our actual kind of producing those goods in the produced capital. And they provide us a lot of different services that we don't financially value typically at the moment. Some of them we do, such as like the provisioning fish and shellfish, but other things like temperature control or air and water quality, those kind of benefits are often not factored into our decision making when we're thinking of how we are going to reduce flood risk or how we're going to tackle coastal erosion. We're often not putting all of these values into the kind of decision-making process. So we're kind of still stuck in the gray infrastructure is normal and nature-based solutions is kind of innovative at the moment in Canada. And these services are really, this whole package of kind of contributing to making life better is not necessarily provided by our traditional gray infrastructure solutions. But the good news is at the federal level that we're really seeing a change in how we see natural infrastructure. Most of you have seen the National Adaptation Strategy. The table I sat on was called Resilient Built and Natural Infrastructure. And the conversations were heavily around both of those types of infrastructure. So that's a really positive step forward. And the National Infrastructure Assessment that is coming is due to cover natural infrastructure as well. And then at the national scale, there's moves to look at natural capital as well. So the Census of Environment is taking on the UN SEEAEA, a great acronym to be able to say when you're presenting, but essentially a system of ecological accounts. So we already have some data looking at urban greenness, but they are working on salt marshes, for example, looking at the biophysical accounts and the value of those accounts. And the idea is to basically factor nature into our economic decision making. So guidance around natural infrastructure is kind of exploding at the moment, particularly in Canada. So we had the nature and natural and nature-based features international guidance, yet another acronym. But basically this brought together people from the UK, the US, the Netherlands, and some of our researchers from Canada to develop international best practice guidance for how we can work with nature for flooding and erosion risk management. So we already have international standards. And then we've been kind of constantly working to try and port some of the experience that we have elsewhere into Canada. And then hot off the press last week, actually, the Intech Centre launched a report looking at how we can work with nature to look at river flooding and erosion. And some of the key kind of messages from that is that we need to work at natural system scales. At the moment, a lot of our climate adaptation work is led by municipalities who are not necessarily equipped with the kind of jurisdiction to work at watershed scales. And we say with the governance piece that Lanyelle mentioned in her presentation is super important, because if we want to work to deliver nature-based solutions, we need to work at natural system scales. Another thing that we're very involved with, and that kind of is heavily tied to working with nature to reducing climate risk, is actually valuing the natural services we already have. So the good news here again is that we now have over 120 local governments across Canada who are actively identifying their natural assets and valuing them, and they want to make disclosures in their financial statements on the value of nature to their citizens. So this report, Getting Nature on the Balance Sheet, was actually prior to COP15, so it's not kind of completely up to date, because as soon as we publish something, it's kind of not up to date, but it's a state of play of where things are at in Canada and internationally in terms of natural capital accounting. In Canada, the bad news is at the moment, our accounting systems do not let us kind of disclose the value of natural assets in our financial statements. So we actually are working with accountants to kind of make it so that we do have guidance. And I think that's my next slide. Yes, try not to overlap. So what's happening now is we're working with a working group of local governments, Infrastructure Canada, CPA Canada, the Public Sector Accounting Board, on voluntary non-authoritative guidance for local governments on how they can recognize the value of natural assets in their jurisdiction. There's a new national standard of Canada for natural asset inventory that will be published this summer. So we've already got one standard, and we have kind of vision for condition assessment, risk assessment, natural asset management, like a suite of standards. And there's also training on natural asset management that's also available online through Royal Roads. And I should stress we are working with the accountants on this. So KPMG are kind of part of this. So there's the Intech Centre, the Natural Assets Initiative, and KPMG who are working together so that we are producing guidance that accountants can work with. Because without accountants, we're not accounting for the full value of nature, basically. Also, we're working to mainstream the recognition of nature's contribution to our lives. So the media is really interested in this as well, and it's really helping us get the message out. Because if people don't value nature, then they're not necessarily thinking about that when they're voting, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the front cover of the Globe and Mail. That talking about, and we had actually a 2-page spread talking about the value of natural assets. So and this is, I think we had 2 covers, so this is the first one. So yeah, so we're trying to get the message out and use the media as well to make people aware. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it. So hopefully that's a good sets the stage for the discussion. And I think I'm handing over to Paige now.
So once again, I guess we'll wait till we've done all 3 presentations and we'll do questions at the end. So our next speaker is Paige Englot. She's a senior hub manager for the Prairies and national manager of community grants for ALUS, which is originally an acronym for the Alternative Land Use Services. Her presentation is entitled Agriculture and Nature-Based Solutions. Paige liaises with our community coordinators and serves as a management resource for local ALUS projects throughout Saskatchewan and Manitoba. So we're going to hear about some very local projects here in Manitoba. Thank you. Welcome.
All right, thank you for the introduction and thank you ClimateWest for having me. I am really excited to see such a diverse group of people, not only in the audience, but also on the panel here. That being said, my expertise is not in the technicalities behind nature-based solutions. My background is around program delivery on the agricultural landscape with farmers and ranchers through the ALUS program. So that's what I'm going to be speaking to today. I thought that our tagline just suited this topic so perfectly. I wanted to start by introducing you guys to ALUS and what we're all about. The tagline for ALUS is where agriculture and nature meet. And here's what we're working to achieve. So we focus primarily on engaging with farmers and ranchers to deliver ecological goods and services on the agricultural landscape. Beyond that, we also focus on building communities, engaging with community partners. With every ALUS community, there's a local legal entity that delivers the program. And then finally, engaging and developing with research partnerships. So ALUS doesn't do in-house research. We partner with external researchers. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a partnership we had with Dr. Wang Hung and the University of Guelph. Our vision, sustaining agriculture, wildlife, and natural spaces for communities and future generations. So to look at that a little bit further, let's take a look at our mission statement here. And the takeaways I want to see is that we're working directly with farmers and ranchers. These are what we would consider our clients, but the beneficiaries of these projects, of these natural infrastructure and EG&S projects, are communities, Canadians, and future generations. So I'm going to talk about this in terms of not just conservation, but production. So these are spaces that are being repositioned to produce natural benefits. And these are spaces that are sometimes considered marginal when we're looking at them from the farm perspective, but we really need to change that narrative. So as we all know, one of the major challenges we're facing around climate change is seeing an increase in these extreme events. What was once a 1 in 100 year rainfall event is now happening week after week, actually, in some years. So this is an incredible challenge. And as a society, we're faced with adapting and building a resilient landscape. So beautiful city of Calgary, when we look at it like this, but when we think about the cost and the damage that can happen through these events, this is something that we just can't ignore. We need to make moves. The cost of inaction is literally in the billions of dollars. So that is an extreme example. Maybe you're a little disconnected from the city of Calgary, maybe you're a little disconnected from the city in general. But this is what we're seeing in rural landscapes. It's not just an urban issue. This is a universal challenge that we're all experiencing. And I'm sure everybody has seen something like this driving out there because it's happening everywhere and it costs a ton of money. Here's another example. And just to put this into perspective, in Alberta, ALUS partners with municipal counties, and the cost of their municipal infrastructure would be worth about $1 billion plus in today's dollars if they were to build it from scratch. And they're spending huge portions of their budget to maintain these. I'm talking tens, $20 million a year to maintain these gray assets or these infrastructure assets. So there's big money being spent to keep these spaces functioning properly, but there's also big opportunity to address those issues somewhere else. So this is a water treatment facility on the left. This is maybe what you think of when you think of treating the water, making clean drinking water. But what if that plant that we see on the left can achieve similar outcomes as the plants and the people that we're seeing on the right? Addressing with local communities and local landowners and harnessing that power creates big opportunity. So let's talk productivity. As I mentioned, my background is around program delivery. I work closely with farmers and ranchers to deliver the ALUS program. And when we talk productivity with farm communities, they're often thinking yield. These types of landscapes are good at producing food and fiber, but there is a lot more opportunity here. So when we look at this project, this is an example from County of Vermilion River in Alberta. And the landowner came to us because he'd identified these marginal spaces around his wetland that weren't well suited to this traditional production, this high productivity ag land. So through the ALUS program, he converted that to deep-rooted permanent grasses, which not only had a positive impact on that water body, but in the entire watershed system. And through the ALUS program, we support the establishment of these projects, but also pay for ongoing management and maintenance. So we want to make sure that everybody understands that this is productive land. EG&S is a product that we are all benefiting from. And these are some of the projects and the EG&S that we are seeing. I'm not going to kind of dive into all of those because I am trying to keep it a little more succinct today, but you can see them there up on the slide. So this is a really nice, simple diagram. One of the big things that I like about this is the connection between the urban and the rural landscape. And that's to say that we do not exist in a silo, whether in your home or in your organization, we are all interconnected. Just like these upstream communities providing watershed benefits have a major impact on that downstream community. And in this diagram, you can see that that has the ability to be incentivized and acknowledged through a payment system. So I'm going to share a couple project examples now. This is a project actually all the way in Norfolk County, Ontario, but this you can see in the before image there, it was a channel system along a traditional cropland. And these types of systems end up with a lot of inputs moving off the ag landscape and into the water. So what was done here with the ALUS program was it was revegetating this system. And actually what the system looks like now, it's even begun to naturalize, and we're starting to see S-curves along this channel. So it's incredible the way nature wants to get back to what it was doing. Couple projects here. When we talk about BMPs, there are a lot of BMPs that are also highly productive for ag land. Exclusion fencing and offsite watering is one example. So this is a wildlife friendly exclusion fence that took place in Saskatchewan. And when we pull the cattle out of these riparian areas, we see less compaction around the water body, which makes it better able to filter nutrients. And here we have a wetland retention, again, acting as a sponge on the landscape to not only store water when we're seeing flood events and slow the movement, but also to release water in times of drought. So these are the benefits of these natural infrastructure projects. When we think about it, we all know that there's opportunity to mitigate flood and drought on the ag landscape. There's also the benefit of extending the life of the gray infrastructure. So talking about that municipality that is spending $10 to $20 million a year on their road system, also retains and filters water and carbon sequestration. So there's a bunch of co-benefits too. One of the wonderful things about investing in natural infrastructure with upstream communities, it also improves biodiversity, but there's community benefits as well. We're investing in these communities and making it a better place to live. And there's additional economic value there too. So this is, I'm going to speak briefly about a pilot that we took part in the Modeste watershed, which is in Alberta, upstream of the capital region, and it's been designated as a high priority area by the Alberta government. So this is the project that we partnered with the University of Guelph on, and what we did is we implemented some strategies using the IM Webs model. So the IMWeb's model, it's the integrated modeling for watershed evaluation of BMPs. This is a super rudimentary look at that, but essentially it's looking at a number of inputs going into the modeling system, looking at weather data, looking at landscape data, and also existing BMP data, and then getting a series of outputs in terms of how is that project or how is that landscape holding water, reducing total suspended solids, other things like that. So I'm gonna speak about that in a little more detail in the next slide. And ESAT is the Ecosystem Service Assessment Tool. So it's a web application, and essentially it's a translation piece between IMWeb's, taking a super complex modeling system and making it more user-friendly on this web application. So believe it or not, this is the simple version of that super complex system. So what we're looking at here is a theoretical question that was put into this modeling data. This is Parkland community who took part in this project. And what we've done is we've asked the model to provide us with information on what is the most cost-effective projects. Two projects that we're looking at here are fencing and riparian buffer projects. But this model has the ability to look at upwards of 50 different project types. So ultimately what this model did is it identified the most cost-effective locations for implementing these projects and found that we could reduce the total suspended solids by 3,000 tons. And ultimately that was at a cost of $57 per ton. So this model data, it also can look at different timeframes, but I'm not going to dive into that. Okay, so with that information, we're able to engage with farmers and ranchers to deliver these projects. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ALUS. So how does ALUS do this? One of the important things that ALUS does is we have a network of coordinators across Canada that literally sit at the kitchen table with farm and ranchers and discuss these projects and design a plan for implementation and a budget. So after that discussion and the plan has been designed, project establishment occurs. This is typically done at a rate of 50-50, 50% cash and in-kind contribution from the farmer and rancher and 50% by ALUS. One of the wonderful things that ALUS does is it doesn't stop there. So these farm and ranch participants enter into a 5- and 10-year conservation agreement where the ongoing management and maintenance needs of the project are detailed, and we support that ongoing management and maintenance piece through an annual payment. So the important thing being there that these lands, again, they're not just conservation, they're production, they're producing ecological benefit, and the farm and rancher is maintaining the project to maximize that ecological benefit. So in terms of that modest project that we did, ultimately we delivered over 1,100 hectares of ALUS programming, lots of opportunity in terms of community engagement and looking at this watershed modeling tool for our municipal partners. Of course, all these things come with challenges. This is a data hungry model, so there is limitations in terms of where this model could be used without finding a substantial amount of data to support it. And these are all our project partners that supported this. And then to end things off, I just want to end it on this quote because this is not a new idea. This is a quote from 1934 by Aldo Leopold. Conservation will ultimately boil down to rewarding the private landowner who conserves the public interest. We all have a vested interest in these EG&S projects, and we need to engage with land managers in order to maintain the health of these projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Paige. That was very interesting. I'm looking forward to maybe having some questions on that afterwards. All right, our next speaker, which is the last speaker of the forum, is Dimple Roy. Dimple is the Director of Water Management at the International Institute of Sustainable Development. She's also a member of the Expert Advisory Council that provides advice and recommendations to the Minister on the government's climate and green plan. Dimple leads ISD's work on water-related policy analysis focused on integrated management of water and related resources in Manitoba, in Canada, and globally. She also directs ISD's Natural Infrastructure and Water Solutions initiative in Canada. Dimple has over 20 years of experience in addressing public policy systems in the water sector, including sustainable agriculture, natural infrastructure, and watershed-based climate adaptation. Her presentation today is entitled Natural Infrastructure for Water Solutions. Welcome, Dimple.
Good morning. I didn't realize when I agreed that I'm going to be the closing speaker of this forum. I feel powerful. So just to start off my presentation, a few words about IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development. We're a global think tank. We've been around since the term sustainable development got popular in 1990. We are focused on work all around the world, but we're headquartered right here in Winnipeg. And in Canada, our work focuses on, I'd say, predominantly on climate adaptation, on energy systems, renewable energy, and on water, the program that I'm with. Slides. Next. Oh, sorry. I'm doing the same thing that everyone knows. All right, so again, the good news of being the last speaker is many of my main points were covered by others, but why natural infrastructure? Why are we talking about natural infrastructure? Essentially, the one thing I'll add from some of the previous speakers on this panel is that we're seeing not only accelerating impacts of climate change, but we're also seeing a widening infrastructure gap. We have in Canada a huge and ever widening infrastructure gap. And in the case of water, we can't keep up. So if we continue to use some of our traditional gray infrastructure solutions, when we think of water, we typically think of pipes and dams and engineered systems to solve those problems. We can't keep up. We don't have the resources or the capacity to keep up. So natural infrastructure is a solution that can complement and in some cases replace some of those gray systems. Joanna showed a version of this. When we say natural infrastructure, we're talking on a spectrum. We're talking about engineered systems, so not just completely natural systems. We're talking about restored and protected systems. The one thing I will say is that in our work, we focus on infrastructure outcomes. So what makes a nature-based solution or a natural area protection project more of a natural infrastructure project is when we start to make the link with particular infrastructure outcomes. So think when we're talking about water, we say infrastructure outcomes involve stormwater management, wastewater treatment, flood and drought risk reduction, things like irrigation. These are actual mandated infrastructure outcomes that governments and others are thinking about today. And what we're hoping for in the future is a resilient infrastructure mix. So a mix of engineered, protected, restored, and engineered natural solutions to meet our resilient adaptation needs of the future. And the one thing that I'll lean on the Intact Center, who we've worked with in the past, and something that Blair Feltmate said a number of years ago, which still resonates with me, is retain what you have, restore what you've lost, and build what you must. So the kind of priority of maintaining and protecting what we already have, the economic benefits of making sure that we actually protect what's already around, must be reinforced in this story. So the Natural Infrastructure for Water Solutions is an initiative that IISD launched last year. It's a 5-year program of work where we're focused on scaling up natural infrastructure. You'll hear me talk about, many projects exist across the prairies. We have many elements of the solutions that we already need. What we're really focused on is the kind of systematic scaling up across the prairies. So this is a multi-year initiative across the prairie provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And our goal is for natural infrastructure to be well understood, adopted, financed, and enabled by policy. Tagline is taking natural infrastructure from novel to normal. Why the Canadian prairies? Some of this has been answered by other presenters through yesterday and today. We are a little bit unique in our ratio of agricultural land. We are a highly agricultural part of the country. We have had significant wetland and other natural area degradation. Our rate of infrastructure gap widening is in some ways remarkable. And something, again, I'll lean on one of Joanna's slides, where we also saw that the amount of resources that are coming into things like DMAF and ICIP, some of the federal investments that are happening in this space are going east and west of the prairies. So the prairies remain a little bit under resourced when it comes to some of those federal programs and dollars that are really wonderful in that they're coming, but the prairies have a ways to go to access some of those resources and programs. So we're focused on the prairies for the next number of years on this project. We are launching next week. This is a sneak preview, and it is actually on our website for the sake of this audience. But this report will be launched next week, the state of play for natural infrastructure on the Canadian prairies. And most of my slides now refer to some of the content in this report. We provide a bit of a bird's eye view of the state of natural infrastructure implementation across the prairies, and some of our early lessons, and this was based on desk research, but also a number of very detailed interviews with experts around the prairies and across Canada. And some of these messages are ones that most of this audience will know, but natural infrastructure is nascent, but there is growing momentum. We're hearing a lot more about nature-based solutions and natural infrastructure. There are a number of interesting projects and initiatives, but gray infrastructure remains the go-to. When it comes down to actual municipal decision-making, gray engineered solutions are definitely still front of mind. And then something I've already said, ensuring that we prioritized protection and conservation and then move towards engineered natural solutions is the way to go. And something that is, again, intuitive to many of us, but came up again and again was the need to invest in people and organizational capacity. So really, if we're talking about scaling natural infrastructure across a region, a key element of that is ensuring that we have the organizational capacity to do so. Just a snapshot from the prairie provinces. So natural infrastructure in Alberta, unsurprisingly, some of the bigger urban centers are leading the way. Calgary and Edmonton have many programs and initiatives in place. Low impact development is much more of a norm in Alberta. It's become quite, I won't say mainstream, but it is a low impact friendly jurisdiction. There is some active watershed management. And what you'll see from my examples are that we are talking about natural infrastructure across urban, municipal, and rural areas. So we are starting to make that connection between rural and urban landscapes because we think it's quite necessary. And then there are many early attempts at integrating natural infrastructure into municipal planning. Really, municipalities are starting to think about natural infrastructure quite extensively in their planning efforts. I won't go into the examples in detail, but we have a number of illustrative examples in our report just to say that you will see across that spectrum. You'll see some of the more traditional conservation projects. Groups like Ducks Unlimited, Canada, Nature Conservancy, and others are focusing, rightly so, on ensuring that our wetlands, grasslands, ecosystems are protected. There are many efforts at restoration, and then many of the urban areas are really focusing on those engineered solutions from green roofs to bioswales, and ensuring that there are permeable areas. The town of Okotoks is a remarkable example in kind of doing a variety of things across, kind of specific programs, but also putting in place some interesting policies, like a topsoil policy for their public spaces, and putting incentives in place for native landscapes and so on. Natural infrastructure in Saskatchewan, again, the city of Saskatoon leading the way on things like green roofs. There is a bit of a lack in that it's the only jurisdiction without a wetland policy, but apparently there is some momentum on this space, a little bit of a lower watershed management capacity. And here, because we're talking about institutional capacity as being one of the key criteria for scaling up, we did keep an eye on the level of watershed management capacity. In all 3 prairie provinces, there are watershed entities that do watershed management, but perhaps more active in Alberta and definitely in Manitoba. Some really interesting projects, again, across that spectrum. The Dry Lake Drainage Project was one that really brought the issue of scale. It was one of the bigger scale projects. So I'm just highlighting that element where it brought together a number of agricultural producers and others, and partnerships are key in many of these examples. And the natural infrastructure in Manitoba, in many ways, we are a bit blessed here. We have kind of a renewed interest in watershed management. There have been some legislative changes in the watershed management policy system and renewal of those efforts. But we also have things like a big endowment fund put in by this government, the Conservation and Grow Trust, that gives, I'd say, in the magnitude of $10 million or so every year, maybe give or take, to natural infrastructure projects across the landscape. So we have a government-based funding system that really enables this, but we also have something called the Collaborative Leadership Initiative, a really great platform of municipal and Indigenous leaders that have come up around the Winnipeg metro region, and some other opportunities to scale up natural infrastructure. Again, the example projects span from some of the more landscape-based conservation projects to things like ISD has been involved in setting up, for example, flooring treatment wetlands in stormwater and wastewater ponds in a few smaller rural municipalities, demonstrating ways in which we can actually create and engineer some of these natural solutions to treat our water for quality. The barriers that we identified through many of these, through our research and the interviews, kind of pull us into 4 buckets of work. So the first one, creating a strong business case for natural infrastructure. Here, we're planning to arm proponents, watershed groups who are really already working on natural infrastructure in many instances, give them the tools and the ability to make a strong business case. How can you, take something that you know to be really helpful, translate that into the outcomes? How do you measure the outcomes and communicate those outcomes well and put values on them? The second bucket on municipalities, ensuring that they adopt natural infrastructure. Again, there's a level of understanding, but adopting natural infrastructure may involve, for example, procurement systems that allow them to actually use some of these solutions in their day-to-day decisions. The third bucket on finance, we're looking into both kind of existing funding sources, but also looking at other financing options, new and old, and how some of these, so it's not just increasing the level of financing for natural infrastructure, but also ensuring that there is an appropriate match between the money and the needs. And then finally, policy. this is kind of more traditional ground for IIST, but looking at how, and we have lots of activity at the federal level, but definitely at the provincial and the municipal level, we still see quite a bit of fragmentation. And what we'd like to see is natural infrastructure kind of enabled in a variety of ways. And so paths to scale, again, as I said, our initiative is about scaling. So apart from those 4 buckets that I talked about, we did also talk about some cross-cutting lenses. Watersheds, an obvious one, and Paige talked about this. We know that ecosystems, especially water. So if we're talking about adaptation and we're talking about the impacts on water, we working on a watershed scale makes sense. And there is an increasing awareness at municipal levels, at agricultural scales, that watersheds actually mean something, even though, there are jurisdictional boundaries. The issue of equity, just building on some of the comments that came up on the earlier panel, what we mean by equity, I mean, there are many elements to it, but across the prairies, knowing that the resourced communities are where the resources end up going to, we're also starting to talk about who has access and how some of the smaller and undercapacitated communities and parts of the provinces can be really targeted. And then the issue of capacity that I've talked about a few times, but ensuring that we have the right capacity at the right place. And one thing I'll flag in our efforts going forward, we're really talking about building a network of champions. So understanding that this is work that we're already doing with multiple partners. We're working with the Winnipeg Metropolitan Region, the Natural Assets Initiative, Water Smart out in Alberta, Alberta Low Impact Development Program, and others. We actually want to actively build champions on the prairies, making sure that we have people who are involved in aspects of natural infrastructure and ensuring that we're able to work with them and provide what is needed for long-term sustainability and scaling of this kind of work. And just to say that apart from this report that's coming out next week, we have a number of other things in the hopper, a number of reports, webinars, some events coming up, just a kind of bit of a list over there. And the picture is from a bus tour we did last fall. I know a few people here, Chris, Joanna, a few others, Darren led us here, and we really drove around the province looking at some of these natural infrastructure projects and had some very spirited discussions about some aspects. So I'll leave it there. I'm really excited to be here and be amongst people who are talking about some of these topics. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dimple. And I guess in the spirit of spirited discussions, I'm hoping that we might have a few questions. We could start from the floor and then maybe go to Mentimeter. We can start with you there. Do you have a question?
Hello. Yeah, I was just wanting to kind of highlight, the United Nations did a study that said that Indigenous people make up 20% of the world's population, yet 80% of the world's biodiversity are on Indigenous managed lands. There is a lack of inclusion of Indigenous capacity for biodiversity and land management actions. Typically, they're relegated to consultation in a community, but never any resource support for different First Nations beyond their reserve. UBC also did a study in Canada, Australia, and Brazil that looked at amphibians and mammals and fisheries, and determined that, again, Indigenous managed lands carry most of the biodiversity, Indigenous or co-Indigenous managed lands. That's one of the things that I see as completely lacking in any of these programs. And what I mean by that is by the decision-making part of the programs, where people actually can be a part of the community, not just someone who's researched or someone who has an engagement session. So meaningful actual action and implementation of Indigenous ideals and practices, along with working with the municipalities, governments, agencies, whoever it is. I'm just kind of wondering, aside from just consultation, where does this kind of stand for nature-based solutions, which we've been doing for millennia?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it touches on a little bit on the discussion we had kind of yesterday. So Indigenous people have, my conversations with Indigenous communities has been like, the value system is nature first, people relying on nature, and then, money is kind of secondary. But then our Western values are kind of money first. So a lot of the work that we're doing, I feel we are trying to kind of shoehorn the value of nature. Whereas in Indigenous communities, the value is already there. It just doesn't have to be in monetary terms. It's already intrinsically there. But because our culture kind of values money first, this is kind of why we're trying to kind of translate that value into monetary terms so it can be taken account in economic decision making. I would add that the Natural Assets Initiative that's doing a lot of the work on natural asset management, we have an Indigenous representative, and we are doing, I say we, it's not, I don't work for them, but I'm on the board, so I can talk about it. But we have projects with Treaty 1 communities in just outside Winnipeg, actually, who are trying to look at how we're doing natural asset management and trying to weave how they understand and how they see it into the processes that, these are kind of processes that have been developed over the last few years, trying to adapt them so that actually is useful to them as well. So that work is happening, and that's definitely one of the directions. That's why we've dropped the municipal from Natural Assets Initiative, to recognize also that this is not just important to municipalities, but also to Indigenous communities, also to watershed communities. Like we have an example of a watershed scale natural asset management plan in conservation authorities in Ontario. So I agree. I totally agree that Indigenous people need to be leading this work, and we are aiming to provide some of the tools to help them.
Yeah, and I should just clarify, I don't mean we need people to come to our community to provide service for us.
No, I mean,
the ones that are determining what's happening on the land outside of our community.
yes, exactly. Indigenous-led conservation, basically. Yeah. So we're trying to kind of provide, maybe our tools are not going to be useful, but at least raise awareness that they exist, and if they can be useful. We're working with the First Nations Financial Management Board as well on the actual guidance on natural asset accounting also, because we're very aware that we need to make sure that this is inclusive.
Paige or Dimple, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll add, ALUS it's a community-led program, and we are always looking for opportunity to have more members of the community at the table. And the cool thing about the program is the decision-making that you're talking about happens at an advisory committee level in each individual community. And we have some communities that have great examples of relationships with Indigenous community members, including having what's known as PAC representation from Indigenous communities on those boards, but we do want to see more of that across all our communities.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is we're looking for Indigenous-led natural infrastructure projects. So to your point, we are not looking to consult with Indigenous communities, but we are looking for Indigenous-led projects because we know of some of them, and we've been helping, for example, in the Seal River watershed and in parts of eastern Manitoba. We've provided some technical support for things that are actually in an Indigenous-led protected area in the Seal River watershed, and on the lower Winnipeg River, we're offering some ecosystem service valuation and other resources, and finding ways to pull together Indigenous knowledge and Western science. But if you have knowledge of Indigenous-led natural infrastructure projects, we'd love to hear about them and find out ways in which we can support or be part of that process. Okay, I'll come to talk to you.
Is there a question online that we could go to? All right. So a question for our panelists. As we know, good O&M guidelines for nature-based solutions needs and policies is required for making it successful? Is there any provincial initiative in prairie provinces? If so, can those be available to the public?
So, you know, this is an area, so operation and maintenance guidelines, I think is the question. So in case the O&M is clearing people. So nature-based solutions are less standardized, and that's something that we're definitely working on in terms of providing guidance to people and, you know, training engineers and geomorphologists and ecologists on actually designing, which includes operation and maintenance. When you design something, you don't just leave and walk away, and you need to monitor and kind of maybe do some adaptive management. There isn't like great standardization approaches, but it's something that I know the Standards Council of Canada is actively looking at right now. And they will have funding to do that work. I would also add that I just came here from the Canadian Network of Asset Managers. So these are the people looking after built assets and doing all the asset management planning at the municipal level. And there was a huge amount of talk about natural assets at that. So there was a panel, there was several presentations. And so the idea is to mainstream this into asset management. So we're already doing a better job of managing our built assets, and the idea is that we should do the same job as being stewards of our natural assets as well. It's that integration. So the O&M, you know, you would consider O&M in your asset management planning, so you would consider it for your natural asset management planning too. But we do need to strengthen standards and mainstreaming from novel to normal. Completely support that, Dimple.
Yeah, my short answer is I don't know of any O&M guidelines on the prairies, but I'd say wetlands are probably the furthest along. We've been talking about wetland restoration, wetland management for amongst natural systems out there. We have probably guidelines, not policies, for wetland management over time, and it's probably from groups like Ducks Unlimited and other wetland focused groups. But yeah, one of the places we'd like to go is to mainstream some of them in policies, maybe through O&M guidelines.
Are you looking at me with my government hat?
Your wetland biology hat.
I just wanted to highlight actually what Dimple had mentioned in her presentation about some funding that we have with the province. The Road Trust, which is a great trust, conservation and road trust. There's a lot of available funds for natural infrastructure for organizations who want to be doing things within Manitoba. So, question. Sure.
Hi, everybody. Lanielle Bateman, Environment and Climate Change Canada, and appreciate the discussion in this panel. Natural infrastructure is dear to my heart, and got to work doing this for a living before I joined government. So it's nice to see, and it was great to hear just some of the developments in the space and the challenges and such. And so my question is probably in the context of the spirited one or a wicked question. So that's a warning in advance. I heard each of you in different ways talk about watershed level planning and initiatives, and it's kind of a difficult question to ask, but just wondered if you had any tips or thoughts on where you're seeing international best practices or examples where this is being put into place. Because I think when you combine the natural infrastructure work and planning on a watershed level scale, you're really talking pretty powerful things from adaptation, biodiversity mitigation. So just any comments or tips you could offer.
So this wasn't a pedantic question, but that was completely the topic of the report we just released last week. So we as part of that report, we did quite a detailed review of watershed management for flood risk and nature-based solutions across the provinces. So what we found is that only in Ontario do we have watershed organizations that are responsible for flood risk, responsible for nature conservation, and commenting on land use planning in one-stop shop. So the GROW program in Manitoba is awesome. We have like watershed districts, but it's the province that is managing flood risk. So the connection between nature and flood risk is not being made in many places. The development in Quebec, where I'm living, like we have moved to say that we want to go towards watershed management approaches. We have the new Bureau de Projet So we're working on it. The BC, after the floods of 2021, that was one of the key recommendations in the reports that came out of that. So I think there is a general, we surveyed about 40 other experts, was consensus that we need stronger watershed management. In terms of where it's being done well, so I come from the UK. When I got my first job in 2000, the Water Framework Directive came in and it basically mandated that member states must do with river basin management planning with specific kind of management for ecological outcomes. And 27 countries of the EU are now doing that on a standardized basis, reviewing their basin management plans. And there are 27 countries that speak different languages. So, we should be, as 10 provinces and territories in Canada, we should be able to do that better. And I think, the disconnect across provincial jurisdiction and federal jurisdiction is hampering efforts to put in like nature-based solutions for river flooding and erosion in particular, but also on a wider scale. So I think we're doing great things in some areas, but the linkage between climate adaptation and nature-based solutions would be strengthened through better watershed management planning. That's my pitch.
Yeah, I think Joanna has the answer on this one. I'll just flag, I mentioned the Collaborative Leadership Initiative here in Manitoba, and it's a consortium of municipal and Indigenous leaders, and they started in some ways because they were thinking about the health of Lake Winnipeg. So downstream from many of their communities, they were thinking about, this lake is in our backyard and we need to do something about it. So it's evolving, but they are starting to have conversations about what upstream management looks like for us and what impact are we having downstream of us. The issue of watershed management is so active in many parts of the world. In Africa, in Latin America, there are active watershed management entities. And I know I've worked in parts of Africa where the connection between flood risk and watershed management is well made. The cities and the urban municipalities are quite involved. The one tangible example, it's not as clearly on climate adaptation, but it's the New York City example for ecosystem services, where the city went upstream and did, basically ALUS style programming and paid farmers and upstream, farmers to do what needed to be done so that the water quality could be improved. But over time, that literature talks about all those co-benefits that came out of it, which include improved flow and climate adaptation benefits. So, I mean, it's been done. And I think that sensibility is there here. It's just operationalizing it is the challenge.
I think we have time for another question. Yeah, in the back.
This is another question for Joanne. I know that the natural environment is important and should be valued. But I was just wondering, how do you put a dollar value on that? And how do accountants do this? They have to have interaction with people working in the field. So that's my question.
Yeah, so great question. So, this is, I think it's definitely of the natural asset management stages, the valuation piece is definitely the piece which is the most interesting and the piece that most people are most interested in. So there's a number of ways of looking at putting a dollar value on ecological services. So there are, a lot of projects when we want to compare across, like in the UK, for example, when they want to compare flood and erosion risk management projects, they have set values for different areas of, like, if you're improving your wetland from this condition to this condition, this is the value of that according to the sign, and it's a benefit transfer. But that is because they want to compare projects across the country to identify which is giving the, roughly the most value. It's not precise measurement. It's not for management purposes. It's for trying to allocate money to where you might like, so that you can compare apples to apples and not with different methodologies involved. So that's one way, benefit transfer. Another way is looking at what gray infrastructure you would need to build to provide the same service to your citizens, for example, and like Taylor Gibson's that are quite far along with natural asset management, they basically rely on an underground aquifer for all their drinking water. So, the value of that that aquifer is like, if we had to get a different water source and build the infrastructure to actually, provide that source to our citizens, that is the value of the aquifer to our community. So there's replacement cost values as well. There's also things like willingness to pay surveys, really your preference. If you're looking at a value of, for example, we're talking to Parks Canada, the amount of money people are prepared to pay to travel to benefit from a resource and stay there, that can be an indicator of the value to society as well. So there's a variety of ways, and the way that the importance of the standardization work that we're doing is so that we can develop a robust way that accountants can deal with, because accountants are not natural asset managing experts, right? So they are also nervous that this is an area that they will need support on from different people. But if we're not accounting for those values, we're still making unsound economic decisions, because we make our decisions based on money.
I think, did you have any other comments, Dimple or Paige?
I'll make a little.
Okay, because I think
addition
we're
on
gonna
that.
wrap up pretty soon.
I'll just add on that conversation around value versus cost. So as Joanne demonstrated, understanding the value of these projects is incredibly complex. But what we've had success with is paying on the cost of these projects. So when I talk about the cost, I mean, what is the opportunity lost from that agricultural land loss, things like that. So we don't have that perfect system to value these projects, but we do need to make action until there is that system in place. So right now, ALUS is paying on the cost of these projects.
I will make a comment again on the same question. So some of the valuation studies we've done in Manitoba, water retention is another common form of natural infrastructure. We get a lot of floodwaters, and we've found just, resurrecting potholes, essentially creating some of these water retention areas where flood water can be retained is really helpful. How we value them is by first kind of listing out the types of benefits that you can get from this kind of project, and then talking to the people. So you're right, your question about talking to the people, you have to understand which benefits are actually being experienced by the people locally. There are some global scale benefits, but we also need to record the local benefits. And then we start the process of valuation, like where is the best information to put a dollar value on it. So it is often a combination of, a model or a system that exists to say, how would you replace this? But sometimes it is the local people who tell us we wouldn't be able to do without this. So it's not, it's not perfect, but we do need some of these valuation studies to be able to make the case that nature, in fact, has a critical role to play in our well-being.
Well, thank you, Joanna, Paige, and Dimple for great presentations and a great discussion. So can you join me in a round of applause?